change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So here in our story, we have this dense crowd of people surrounding Jesus. And Jairus, he comes and he falls down at Jesus' feet and he starts begging Jesus to come and to lay his hand on his daughter. And that's because Jairus believes that Jesus could only heal his daughter if he came and he touched her. He doesn't have the same kind of faith that the centurion had. But my question here is, why did Jairus wait so long to come to Jesus? Why did he wait to the time where his daughter was at the point of death? That synagogue that we're talking about, that's only about 2 blocks away from Peter's home where Jesus was probably staying. And so it seems that Jesus wasn't Jairus' first choice, but Jesus was his last resort. And that's often what Jesus is for us, that we'll try almost anything first. And as people, we often won't cry out until we've actually lost everything, like our freedom. And there's many people that do find Jesus in prison when they've lost everything, when they've lost their freedom. And there's other people, they find Jesus when they lost their dignities, because a lot of people, they also find Jesus in recovery groups. But there's also many people who have lost everything and they still won't cry out to Jesus to save them because they would rather perish when they didn't have to. And it's all because of their pride, which is only to be called foolish pride. And so they never cry out. And Jesus here, and even though Jairus, he didn't make him his first choice, Jesus still sees Jairus as the man with the greatest need in this crowd, and he's still willing to go with him. And we see that Jairus, he knew that Jesus could heal his daughter, because here it even says so. Just lay your hand on her and she will live. But he waited until he was frantic. And this is his only daughter, and she's only 12 years old. And we also know from the story that he has a wife who's home and she's attending her. And she may have been the one that had been urging him to go to Jesus for a while and to quit being so stubborn, because maybe he's wasted too much time now. Because Jairus, he knew where to go, because Jesus taught in his synagogue. And Jairus, he was probably there when that demon was cast out of the man. And Jairus, he probably knew the centurion who built the synagogue, because he's a leader of that synagogue. And he had seen what Jesus had done for the centurion's servant. And he's probably heard of all the healings that Jesus did. So Jairus, he knew. But now he's in a hurry because he believes that Jesus needs to get there before his daughter takes her very last breath and actually dies. Because up until this point, no one has ever been raised from the dead. And so they keep trudging through this crowd, Jesus and Jairus and his disciples. And then there's this woman who really shouldn't be there, who is also in the crowd. The reason she shouldn't have been there is because she's ceremonially unclean, which is telling us that she has a physical problem. And she's had this problem for 12 years, which happens to be the same age as Jairus' daughter. And it calls her physical problem a flow of blood. So this is not a normal menstruation, because what it is her menstruation, it never stops. And in the law, it says that any menstruation from a woman makes that woman ceremonially unclean for the whole time of that menstruation period. And so this woman, she wasn't allowed to join into any of the regular social functions. And although by her physical appearance you couldn't tell, she had to live outside of society for these 12 years, and she couldn't be around people. Because if anybody touched her, the the law said that that person would be made ceremonially unclean until the next day. In fact, they couldn't even touch anything that she's touched because that would also make them unclean. And so this woman, she hasn't been able to go to the temple or to go to the synagogue or to her marketplace or to join into any of the religious feasts, which were the Jewish holidays. And she's broke. She doesn't have any money anymore because she spent it all on doctors. And the only thing the doctors could do for her is to take her money. And this woman, she's never seen Jesus before. She's only heard of him. And she keeps telling herself over and over in her head, if I can only touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. And she believed what she was telling herself to the point where she had talked herself into actually doing it. And she was willing to try it. And even though this seems almost like it's kind of a superstitious belief, and what it's talking about the hem of his garment, Jews, they had tassels, and they had 4 tassels on the corners of their robes. And all Jewish men, they had these tassels on their robes to remind them that they were God's people, that they were his chosen people. And they were all the color of hyacinth blue, which is kind of like a periwinkle blue. And so here we see that Jesus, he's just dressed like any other Jewish man. He just wears regular clothes. And she knew that it would be wrong for her to touch him because she knew that that would make him unclean. And she probably didn't believe that a man so holy would want to touch her because nobody did, because she was treated much like a leper was treated. And so here she is, and now she's sneaking through this crowd, and she's bumping into people, and people are bumping into her. And she knew that everyone she touched was made unclean, even though the people she touched never knew that they were unclean. And she probably felt very badly about it. But she wants to keep this very private because her condition is embarrassing. But this is her chance to get in there, to touch that hem of his clothes, and then to get out of there as quickly as she can. And so she does it, and she touches him. And she feels the power of God from Jesus flowing through her as the healing starts to occur. And we're told immediately that her flow of blood, it dried up. And then she tries to get herself lost into the crowd. But Jesus, he knew she was healed because he felt it too, because that healing was given to her from him. But this woman, she's trying to get away because she thinks she stole the healing. And Jesus, he didn't want her to go away with that guilt and to always have that feeling that she stole a healing from God, because this healing God wanted to give to her. And so Jesus here, he just stops everything and he says, who touched my clothes? Which sounds really quite odd when you think about that. Who touched my clothes? And at least the disciples, they thought it was very odd because they called Jesus out on that. And they say, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? And now here, we just have to stop. And we just have to take a minute, and we just need to think, what was Jairus thinking, this leader of the synagogue? What was he thinking in this particular moment? Because he's standing there, and he has all this anxiety because he's trying to rush Jesus off and to get him to his home to heal his daughter before she dies. And Jairus, he probably wasn't bold enough to say it out loud because he can't afford to offend Jesus, because now Jesus is his only hope. But if Jesus is your only hope, well, then that's the right place to have your hope. And so there's nothing that Jairus can do about this. He can't hurry Jesus up, and he's just going to have to wait until Jesus is done. And he still knows right here that they're going to have to fight through the crowd to get to his house. And we all know what this feels like. We know what it feels like to be late for something and then to be stuck in traffic because of road construction or because of an accident. And the only thing that's keeping you from getting to your destination is just that man over there with a flag or a stop sign. And he's keeping you from being where you need to be. And there's nothing you can do about it. So Jesus here, he looks into the crowd and he sees her, and he doesn't point her out. He lets her come to him because he gives her the opportunity to come and to confess. And she does this, and she falls down at his feet, and she tells him the whole truth. And then here, Jesus, he does the most wonderful thing. He calls her daughter. And no one has called this woman daughter for a long time. And daughter is a very intimate term. And we never hear of Jesus ever calling anybody else daughter. And so this shows us how much Jesus loved her, though he had just met her. And Jesus tells her that it was her faith that healed her. And so he doesn't let her go on believing it's just her superstitious belief that it was about his hem that healed her. But even though her reasoning wasn't perfect, it was her faith in Jesus that Jesus could heal her, and that it's not because of the touching of the tassel, but her faith was placed in the person of Jesus. So immediately after this, we read, if we were reading Mark's gospel, it tells us that some of the people, well, they came from Jairus' house and they came to him into the crowd. So the same spot, they come to the crowd and then they tell Jairus, they say, your daughter's dead. You don't need to trouble the teacher any longer. And so if you can imagine Jairus' frustration, he could be thinking, well, maybe if Jesus hadn't delayed so long, we may have made it on time. But Jesus, he turns to him and he reassures him and he says, do not be afraid, only believe. And what we need to learn here is to believe Jesus' word and to believe his promises, no matter what our circumstances look like, that we can always trust him. And no matter what others say to us, no matter the things that we've heard or how bad things look, or even how we feel, that we can trust Jesus. And Jairus here, he doesn't take their advice because he sees that Jesus is working and he's decided here to believe Jesus. And so they continue on in faith. And then they finally get home. And when they get to the house is already in the middle of a funeral service. Because in Israel, when a person dies, they bury that person on the very same day. And so here we read about these flute players and the noisy wailers. And what these people were, they were professional mourners. And in Israel, even the very poorest families, they had to hire professional mourners. And there would never be any fewer than 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman. These people, because they were professionals and they say that she's dead, they knew death because that's all they did. They were the funeral directors. And the kind of wailing that they were doing out there, the screaming and the crying, this was not a sincere display of sorrow. And the reason you can tell that this wasn't sincere is how quickly they switched from crying and wailing to ridiculing and mocking Jesus. And so now Jesus, he puts those professional mourners out of the house because they're all scoffers. And scoffers are enemies to those people who are trying to believe God. Scoffers are always the enemies of faith. And I personally, I hate praying in a mixed group of believers and non-believers, especially for the things that take faith, the things like a healing or deliverance. And in these kind of cases, I only like to pray with genuine believers. And I'm not saying that they have to be old believers or mature believers, but they have to be real believers because I know that God hears real believers' prayers, but he doesn't hear the prayers of scoffers. And there's a lot of people who call themselves Christians, but if they're not of the born again type and they think of Jesus as somebody far off, as not of somebody that's actually living in their heart, I kind of have a lot of trouble with their prayers too. And I've had many times where I'm praying for something serious and I know I'm praying and people will look at me strangely and they'll look at me because I'm praying for something and believing it's going to happen. And they'll say, well, we're all praying. And I'm just thinking, yeah, but does God hear your prayers? So the only people that Jesus, that he allows in this room is the mom and the dad, and then Peter, James, and John. He only lets in believers. And this isn't a big production. There's no big, great ritual, and Jesus doesn't wave his hands around and say some special type magicish kind of words. He just takes her hand And it says in our text, it says, little girl, I say to you, arise. But literally in the Aramaic, he's saying, little lamb, wake up. And I love stories like this because Jesus, he doesn't go around healing every dead little girl. And Jesus here, he didn't do it for the little girl. In fact, this is the first time Jesus has ever done this for anybody in the scriptures. And so this is not common. But the reason that I love this is because what I think Jesus is doing here is that he's having pity on a father who's so brokenhearted and who only has a little faith in him, just enough faith to ask him to help. And that's why I love this, because I believe Jesus does this exact same thing for me. When I'm brokenhearted over someone I love and I can't do anything about it, and I just go ahead and I ask him with my little faith, and I've seen him do things. And he doesn't do them on the account of the person that I'm praying for, that person deserves it, because that person may not have any faith at all. But I believe Jesus does that because Jesus, he pities me. Because if you look at the story with this little girl, she didn't have any faith at all. She couldn't have any. She was dead. She had no faith. And we'll see Jesus do this 2 more times in the Bible, where he'll have mercy on a widow because her son died in the town of Nain. And then we'll also see it with his dear friend Lazarus. But there will be one day when Jesus will bring us all back from the dead, and he'll do that, and he'll do it permanently. But I believe here Jesus did this for this father. Now Jesus, he leaves his house. He gives them instructions, says, don't tell anyone, and give her something to eat. And now Jesus, he starts walking away, and the crowd is still there, and they're following him. And then there are these 2 blind men that are following him. They're crying out, and they're saying, Son of David, have mercy on us. And this is the first time we ever hear Jesus being called the Son of David. And the Son of David is his messianic title, because everybody knew that the Messiah was going to come from David, from his descendants. And so these guys, these blind men, they're calling Jesus the Messiah. And though they're physically blind, spiritually, they have a little bit of sight. And they're confessing Jesus to be the Christ. But you see, there was a price to pay for calling Jesus the Christ back then. Because the Pharisees, well, what they'll threaten to do is they'll threaten to remove anyone from the synagogue who calls Jesus the Christ. And Jesus, he doesn't go and he doesn't heal these men out in the street, in the public eye. Jesus waited until they came into the house. And that's probably because the whole town was probably going crazy with all these extraordinary miracles and healings that were going on. And even though these 2 blind men, that they've already confessed that Jesus is the Christ, he still asks them and he says, do you believe I can do this? And Jesus, he's not asking them to make some great proclamation of how much faith they have in him or any proof of their faith. So when they're asked, they only answer him with this simple, yes, Lord. And then Jesus, he touches their eyes and he says, according to your faith, let it be to you. Now, what this doesn't mean is that if you have enough faith, you'll be healed from your blindness, or that your healing will be done to you into the accordance of the proportion of the faith that you do have. Because nowadays we hear a lot of people that have this type of thinking, and they make people feel guilty when they're not healed from some type of disability. And people will say, well, they weren't healed because they didn't have enough faith. And that type of thinking, it's not biblical. But you'll hear people teach that. But what Jesus is saying here is, because you say you believe, I can heal you. I'm granting your request. And so they're not being healed by the amount of faith they have. They're only being healed here by their simple confession of faith that they believe Jesus can. But then after these guys are healed, they don't have enough faith to obey Jesus, because Jesus told them not to tell anyone. And then they're going around and it says that they told everyone. And what this does, again, this makes it harder for Jesus to get around, because the crowds, they just keep getting bigger and bigger. Again, I think this applies to us, and I think it applies to us when we have spiritual blindness, because I think Jesus, he asks us the same kinds of questions, that when we come to him when we come to receive him as the Christ. And he comes to us and he says, do you believe that I am able to do this? Do you believe I can save you? Do you believe I can forgive you? And we have this simple, yes, Lord. And then we say something like, Jesus, come into my heart. And then he does this. And it's only because of the simple confession in him. But if we only ask Jesus to come into our hearts because we want to be safe, just because we don't want to go to hell, but we really don't believe in him, we only say, yes, Lord, but we don't mean, yes, Lord, I don't really know what's going to happen to those people. I don't know what happens. But if you do believe that he is the Son of David, that he is the Christ, and you do receive him, that he will remove your spiritual blindness. And he does this all the time, and it's all according to how you believe. And so now we have this case of this mute man, and we can see that demons here, that they sometimes can cause physical afflictions. And this is not saying that all people with physical afflictions are demon-possessed or caused by demons. But in this case, it was obviously demon possession, and the man was also mute, which we find out was caused by the demon. And from a Jewish understanding of demon possession during this period of time, this man could never be delivered, because the rabbis during this period, they believed the first step in exorcising a demon was to trick the demon into revealing his name, because then that name, it could be used as a handle to remove the demon. But that couldn't be done with this man because this man was mute. But when Jesus cast out this demon, the affliction of being mute, it also left, because this time it was caused by the demon. And even the Pharisees that we're looking on, they admitted that a demon had been cast out, that this was not just a physical healing. And so now you have this mute man, and he's speaking, and all the multitude are marveling. And they say they've never seen anything like this in Israel. But then we start to see the Pharisees, and they're starting to envy Jesus, and then they're starting to square off against Jesus. And they begin this accusation. And they're saying that Jesus' power, that it comes from the devil, from the ruler of demons. And this will keep occurring, and they will keep accusing Jesus of this. We'll see this again when we get to Matthew chapter 12. But in the reality, it's the Pharisees that are being used as agents of the devil. And Jesus will later tell them that the devil is actually their real father, not God. All right, and so now in our chapter, we're given this overview of the ministry, that what Jesus is doing, and that he was going to all the villages, and he was going into all the cities, and he was teaching and preaching the kingdom of God. And Jesus, he was healing everybody of everything. And his desire, we can tell, is to get through every city, because Jesus, he loves these people. Because Jesus, he wants to alleviate as much suffering as he can during this allotted period, this time of grace toward Israel. And here it says that Jesus, he's moved for compassion for the multitude. And these words, moved with compassion, well, they're the strongest Greek words for pity ever used. And the only place it's ever found being used is right here. You don't find it in the classical Greek, and you don't find it anywhere else in the New Testament.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,